Hello everyone. Welcome to this second episode of our ReSES ID seminar. Today we will be discussing the problem of harm in economics. ReSES ID seminar aims at facilitating interdisciplinary dialogue on the potentials and limits of economics as a policy science. This seminar series is a part of our Argumenta project, rethinking the serviceability of economics to society, and this project is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation. ReSES project is the public phase of our research project called Economics as Serviceable Social Knowledge, and that project is funded by the Academy of Finland. My name is Emrah Aydinonat, and I am a philosopher of economics working at TINT, Center for Philosophy of Social Science at the University of Helsinki, and I am also the leader of the ReSES project. We are today excited to have two esteemed speakers with us. Our first and main speaker is George DeMartino. He's a political economist and a professor at Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. His research focuses on the intersection of ethics and economics. George has this recent book called The Tragic Science: How Economists Cause Harm, and it's a brilliant book, must read for economists and philosophers of science, and he will be talking about parts of the book today. Our second speaker, the discussant, is Caterina Marchionni. Caterina is a researcher in practical philosophy at the University of Helsinki, and she is a member of TINT, Center for Philosophy of Social Science, and she specializes in philosophy of science with particular interest in economics and the social sciences. Before we start, I should note that we will be recording the seminar today. Note, however, that we will not record the discussion at the end of the seminar to create a more relaxed environment for dialogue. So many thanks for being a part of this seminar. We hope the talks today will spark thought-provoking conversations during the general discussion. I hope you will enjoy the talks and the discussion. Now I'd like to give the virtual floor to George. George, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, Emrah, Caterina, Anita, all of you who have been involved in this. I so appreciate this opportunity. When one writes a book, one doesn't know if anyone will ever read it. So when there's a chance to talk about it, it's an honor that you've thought the book worthy of this kind of conversation. I prefer to talk about work in progress rather than completed work, because with work in progress, you can always say, well, yes, if you get a difficult question, I'm going to work on that next. With a finished product like a book, you're stuck with what you have written. But in fact, this is a project that I'll talk about in a minute that continues for me. The book is finished, but the broader project of which it's a part that I'll talk about continues. And so I am very keen to hear criticisms, suggestions, concerns about the book, because I will continue to be thinking and writing in these areas for quite some time. So thank you all. Thank you all who are attending as well. Let me go ahead and share screen. I've prepared a lot of slides today, and let's see if I can get this to work. All right, I think that's actually the slideshow. Emrah, is that okay? Yeah,
yes, it looks okay.
Okay, good. Then I'm going to move you and me off screen. Here we go. All right, so we're talking today. Talking today about some of the themes in the book: the tragic science, how economists cause harm, even as they aspire to do good. Here's what I want to do. The book takes, let me just tell you the premise of the book. The premise of the book is that we are in a dangerous business, that despite being that the most well-trained, the most virtuous economists, when they go out in the world to make interventions, necessarily cause harm even as they aspire to do good. That is not an indictment of the profession. It is a statement, I would argue, it's a statement of fact, no different from the medical profession. When a physician goes and tries to make an intervention to make someone better, they are often in position to do harm. That's true of every doctor. Now, in economics, the problem is that we have weaponized this concept of harm. That is, we are broken up into different tribes. You've got neoclassicals, Keynesians, post-Keynesians, Austrians, feminists, Marxists, and so forth. And we've weaponized this harm. We point to the harm that the other groups do, rather than recognizing that all of our economic practice is fraught with the risk of harm. And so it seems to me that this is a case where there should actually be quite productive conversations across the different camps that constitute economics, because it's actually a shared problem. But yet we have been prevented from doing that by virtue of the fact that we have taken this concept of gratuitous harm and weaponized it. So the book is trying to engage this issue of harm, to make the case that it's endemic to our work, our profession, but then to explore how we have been trained to deal with the harm that we cause. And that's where the indictment comes in. I argue that we have been trained to treat harm in a very mechanistic way that I'm going to explore today, that I call moral geometry, that this is inappropriate given harm's complexity. I then will, and this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about harm's complexity. I'm going to talk about how we've been trained to deal with it with this moral geometry. I am then going to offer various critiques of moral geometry. Many of these are not new critiques. It must be said, I've drawn heavily on many other critics in the profession. And I explore a range of what I take to be serious open questions, or at least open questions, but even more problems, even fatal problems with moral geometry. And then I conclude the book, and I'm going to conclude the talk today saying something about how we could and should manage the harm that we do better. How could we do better? One of the criticisms I have of the book myself, so I'll tell you what it is now, because I'll be interested to hear whether you share this, is it's a worry. It's not a criticism. It's the worry, does anyone think this way anymore? Are we still moral geometers in economics? And this is a difficult question to answer, because economics is going through many changes at the moment. It's not the same profession I was trained into in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And so there's lots of diversity of practices now. And so something I need to wrestle with in my future work is the profession moving away from moral geometry? And if so, where is it headed? And that's something I look forward to. But it's at least something for you to keep in mind. Does anyone still think this way? Are we still moral geometers, or have we all been trained in it, but are we now all leaving it aside? The project of which this book is a part is it's a project to establish a new field of inquiry that doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist in any kind of formal way, what I call the field of professional economic ethics. And this project, I'm just going to say a word if there are any students in the group here about how projects evolve, to show you how serendipitous things can be. I was teaching Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, Utopia, a wonderful libertarian scholar years ago. And in a footnote, just a footnote, he mentions the maxi-max decision rule, which is a decision rule that essentially says, of all the available options, always choose the one that has the highest possible payoff, full stop. Under maxi-max, you don't take account of probabilities. You just look to see what is the absolute best option, best outcome of each potential option, and you then choose that one. So, for example, if you have a choice between putting your savings in government bonds that are secure, and on the other hand, throwing all of your money into a lottery where your chances of winning are a tiny, tiny fraction of 1%, the maxi-max rule would say always throw all your money into the lottery, because in the infinitesimally small chance that you win the lottery, you'll be better off than if you put it into bonds. And of course, Nozick makes the obvious point that this decision rule is ridiculous. It's ridiculously reckless. In fact, no one could live a life applying the maxi-max decision rule because we'd all be dead. It's far too dangerous. But of course, I was teaching this in the early 1990s. This is when the class was. And this was still in the moment of this euphoria around the neoliberal experiment that was being undertaken by my profession, our profession across the world. And it occurred to me that, in fact, if there was any justification, if there was any decision rule in play in my profession's advocacy of this policy experiment, it was maxi-max. There was no consideration. If you go back and look at the literature among those who were advocating for the former Soviet Union and the global South to make this leap of faith, there was no consideration of alternative possible avenues forward. There was no consideration of the risk of failure. The argument was that the neoliberal model had among one of its within its probability distribution, it had among its possible outcomes one that was better by far than any alternative, full stop. And I thought, this is incredibly reckless. How could this possibly be consistent with our profession's body of professional ethics? So I naively went to look to see, I went to the American Economic Association to find out what is our code of ethics? What does it say? And what did I find? We have no professional ethics. Economics is one of the only professions left in the world that by the early 2000s had no statement of ethical principles, no code of conduct, and most importantly, for my purposes, no long tradition in which practitioners wrestle with the ethical problems, the challenges that they confront in their work. Hence, that's what I mean by the field of professional ethics, not a code, but a tradition of inquiry into the ethical problems that we face. We had no professional ethics. Economists received no training in what it meant to be an ethical economist. And so I set out on a project to recruit people to work with me to create this tradition. The first effort in that affair was the Economist's Oath, which appeared a little over 10 years ago. Then the Handbook of Professional Economic Ethics, the Oxford Handbook that I co-edited with the eminent Austrian economist Deirdre McCloskey. Since then, things have started to change in the profession, and I'd love to say it's because of my books, but it's not. Here's what happened. In 2010, 2011, a film, The Inside Job, about the financial crisis of 2008 was released. It was an exploration of the causes of the crisis of 2008, and it included a few interviews with economists, prominent economists, who had given testimony and given testimony to Congress, US Congress, written reports, all designed to prevent financial regulation, without ever disclosing that they were getting paid for this work. This was extracurricular work that they were getting paid for by, in one case, by financial interests. So there was an obvious conflict of interest, and the filmmaker did a brilliant job. I don't know if you've seen this film. It actually won the Oscar that year for Best Documentary. Did a brilliant job of exposing how unprepared these economists were to discuss the problem of conflict of interest. They'd never been trained to think about it. The AEA, the American Economic Association, responded by strengthening its conflict of interest rules. And then in 2018, it finally adopted a code of ethical conduct. Again, not because of my work, but because of this horrible scandal in which there were these terribly misogynist postings to what's called the Economic Job Market Rumors discussion board, anonymous, where graduate students typically talk about who's getting what jobs, and it was just filled with hate and misogyny. Alice Wu published a study of this in 2017. The association was just taken aback, and so it adopted its code of ethics. Since 2011, there have been moves toward introducing codes of ethics and statements of ethical principles by economic associations, in fact, all over the world. The problem is, most of them are targeting things that are really what I call the low-hanging fruit here. Conflict of interest, introducing conflict of interest standards, and primarily rules about how we as economists treat each other, how we treat other economists. Now, that's perfectly good. We needed that in a bad way. The problem is, what about our responsibilities to those we purport to serve? How we treat them? Where's the question in these codes about the harm that we can do? The answer is it is not there. In the book, I argue that economists themselves, as I said earlier, do induce harm. I call this econogenic harm, economist-induced harm. And yet these questions around econogenic harm are largely ignored in the new codes. It's not good enough. We have just taken the first steps toward doing what we need to do in this regard. All right, now let me talk about, excuse me for 1 second. Let me talk about harm. When I wrote the previous books, I had this notion that I think is shared by my profession that harm is a pretty simple idea. It's pretty obvious. You can see when someone's getting harmed. It was only after I'd published The Economist's Oath that I started to wrestle with the idea of harm. And of course, as soon as you start to think about it, you realize that harm is a terribly complex concept. It's internally heterogeneous. And that's what I'm trying to show in this taxonomy that you see on screen now. People can be harmed in many distinct ways. There are physical harms, psychological harms, economic harms, and so forth. And within each of those categories, there are many different ways that people can be harmed. So it's internally heterogeneous, point one. Point two, the notion of harm is deeply contested. Different philosophical traditions consider different things to be harmful and different things not to be harmful. And even when they agree, these different traditions, on what is harm, they will often disagree about who is culpable for harm and who's responsible for ameliorating harm. It is a contested area, as it should be, given that the stakes are so high when we start to think about harm. Here I've given, in the book, I've got this very loose taxonomy of harms. Here are 4 categories. Let's continue. There are also social harms, moral harms, and autonomy harms. Just to take, I don't know, one, let's take moral harms. There's erosion, inversion, and collapse of important ethical or spiritual values or systems of virtues, sensibilities, and norms. These kinds of harms can happen as a consequence of, let's say, of economic development, of regime shifts in a nation's economy. Social harms, autonomy harms. Each one of these is complex, each category, and each is contested, and each is fraught. I argue in the book that we need to keep all of these conceptions of harm in play when we think about how we should comport ourselves as economists. One implication of thinking of harm as internally complex, excuse me, and understanding that people can be harmed in many different ways, well, two implications is that harms can compound and harms can cascade. By compounding harms, I simply mean that a particular kind of harm gets worse over time. Now, the image we're all trained to think of in terms of harm in economics is that a harm is like a rock that's thrown into a pond. And initially, it creates these big ripples, but very quickly the ripples dissipate. And the further they get from the point of contact, the smaller are the effects of the rock. That's how we're trained to think in economics. Think about the case for free trade. Yes, we know there are going to be harms, but we're able to think of, we're trained to think of them as short-term and as quickly becoming minor and smaller. We can therefore categorize them or corral them under this idea of temporary adjustment costs. But what if there are harms that don't dissipate like ripples on a pond? What if there are harms that actually grow bigger over time? Now I want you to think of an avalanche of snow shooting down a mountain. It starts small and slow, but it gathers energy and gathers force and becomes much worse over time. That would be an instance of compounding harm. I'm going to come back to this later on, but the point I want to ask you now to be thinking about is this. What harms that are caused in economics are like ripples on a pond that dissipate, but which compound over time? In addition, once we understand that harm has all these different features, we might come to see that they're not independent. If someone is harmed in one way, that harm may not just deepen over time, it may spread out across the taxonomy. Think of an economic harm, being rendered unemployed. This can, and I'll return to this later too, this can generate many of the other kinds of harms that we see in the taxonomy. So harms can radiate outward across the taxonomy. All right, now here's the question. If we agree that harm is complex and it includes all the categories and probably more that I just had up on the screen for us, the question then is, how does the standard approach that we've been trained in, standard welfare economics, how does it instruct us about how to think about harm? What is its taxonomy? And the answer, very neatly, is this. That's the full taxonomy. People are harmed when they suffer a loss of welfare. Full stop. I find this problematic, as you can imagine. This is part of what led to the writing of the book. And the question that I had to address in the book is this: how do we get from a rich, deep sense of harm that we all know is correct, that is, that people can be harmed in all these different ways and they're complexly linked. How do we get from that rich taxonomy of harm to this impoverished taxonomy of harm? And I think the answer is, it begins at the very beginning in how we specify human agency, and in particular, how we specify what are goods. What is it that people value? This is a very simple, I tried to explore this in greater depth in the book, but here's a very simple story. We were trained and we teach our students in Econ 101 that people benefit when they get increased access to the goods that they value. Where the goods can be economic or non-economic. I have a beautiful view out my window. That's not necessarily an economic good, but it's a good nonetheless that economics has something to say about. So people benefit when they get increased access to goods that they value. The child has gotten so excited about what it is I'm trying to say. That's very nice. Next, goods are theorized as nothing but welfare transmitters. That's how we theorize them. That's what allows me to compare this cup with this clock, with the view out my window. They're all different goods, but they're all comparable by virtue of the fact that they're reduced to nothing but the welfare that they transmit to me. This implies that all goods are welfare comparable. There's nothing else to compare in two goods. They have no value other than the welfare that they generate for me. The next point then, it doesn't necessarily follow, but it is a critical step in the argument in terms of how we think of goods. Goods are radically substitutable, either completely substitutable or at least radically substitutable. This conception of goods is where the problem lies. Because if you endorse this view of what are goods, we are led quickly to see what is harm in the welfarist framework. People are harmed very simply when they suffer diminished welfare that results from diminished access to the goods that they happen to value. Full stop. That's the definition of harm. It's that conception that leads to this taxonomy of harm in our economic training. It is reduced to loss of welfare. It's these conceptions around goods that almost demands in a commonsensical way this conception of harm. The diminution in harm can be either realized harm we actually experience when our welfare is reduced, or potential diminution. I'm going to come back to that concept later on in the talk, because it's quite complicated. It's quite important. I shouldn't say complicated. It's quite important, and we tend to gloss over it in economics. All right. Now this is how the framework is taught. Again, this is the same conception that trained PhDs have in their heads if they've been trained in the standard way, but it's also the way we train our students. It's very intuitive. If you go into any textbook, Econ 101, you're going to find something like this. We have an agent, Maria. She values goods in the way I just said. Imagine that she has 5 apples, but now for some reason, maybe the price has gone up. She has diminished access to apples. She can now only receive 4. What happens? She suffers a loss of welfare because of the diminished access to the good that she values. She's worse off than she was before. She's on a lower indifference surface. But we then teach our students not to worry about Maria, because Maria can be made whole, by which I mean she can be made indifferent. I'll come back to that. She can be made whole by increased access to one or more other goods that she values. So perhaps she's lost an apple. She's gone from 5 to 4. Her welfare is diminished. We assure our students that there will always be some number of another good, in this case pears, that were she to receive those extra pears, she will be fully compensated. She'll be fully repaired. She'll be indifferent between having the 5 apples and the 4 pears, or having only 4 apples, provided she has 6 pears. And so we show this, her welfare shoots right back up from the diminished Y to the original X. She has been rendered whole. It's intuitive. Students, of course, buy this argument. Why not? The question is, what are the scope conditions? When is this story appropriate to tell, and when is it not appropriate to tell? I'll come back to that. When is it appropriate? The standard moral geometry that I'm describing, of course, just to remind you, or for those who have not studied this, appears in the form of very simple decision rules. Kaldor-Hicks, the compensation test, where if the gains to the winners are greater than the losses to the losers, then we can endorse a policy. This is typically enacted through cost-benefit analysis, where we actually calculate the benefits, the gains, and the losses, and we can do the math to compare. It's also foundational to social, that is to say, another form of moral geometry is social welfare functions. I want to argue that all of them depend on the kind of logic that I've already laid out for you, this kind of welfare reductionism where all harms and all goods are reduced to nothing other than welfare and the enabling assumptions about substitutability and the like that we've just discussed. There are, of course, innumerable alternative moral geometries. First, do no harm, if you take that as a decision rule, is an alternative moral geometry. Maxi-max, maxi-min, mini-max. Their welfare can be specified in many different ways. The point is, there are many distinct moral geometries. We find several in economics. We find many more in other professions. And so I just want to be clear. The ones I'm going to be talking about today are the ones you see at the top there. Kaldor-Hicks, cost-benefit analysis, social welfare functions. The problem, of course, is if there are multiple, innumerable decision rules, moral geometries, what I call moral geometries, then of course we need a decision rule. We need another geometry that tells us which geometry is the correct geometry to use in any particular case. The problem is there is none, and yet the moral geometry we take biases the outcome of our inquiry. This is a serious problem for a profession that wants to have a definitive policy answer. We need to know what is the right moral geometry if you think that moral geometry is the right way to go. Now, I mentioned the scope conditions. When is it appropriate to think that Maria can be made whole? And when is that story that we see in Econ 101 not told? When is it not appropriate? What about this case? Maria is a low-income woman who, owing to a change in economic policy, let's call it austerity policy, she can no longer afford a pharmaceutical that her child needs, one of her children needs to survive. As a consequence, her daughter dies. Does this happen as a consequence of economic policy changes? You bet your life it does. So she's now lost a child. She's gone from 2 to 1. In the standard approach, her welfare has diminished from X to Y, just as if she'd lost an apple. Okay, what about the next step? Do we think that Maria can be repaired through compensation, some amount of some other goods? Let's say that takes the form of money, some payment of money that she can use for whatever she wants. Well, under the standard logic we just talked about a moment ago, there should be some amount of money such that she would choose fewer children and more money rather than more children and less money. But of course, if you were to meet a Maria who felt that way, you would find her unfit to be a parent, or you would at least have serious questions in your mind about her being fit to be a parent. Question, is this case in the textbook, the Econ 101 textbook, the page after the diagram with pears and apples? The answer is no, it's not there. The student is left with just the pears apples comparison and never gets into cases like this, where I think it would be obvious to most students that it's not appropriate to think that Maria could be repaired at all, and certainly could not be repaired with some amount of money. And yet, I want to argue that these are the kinds of cases that economists so often confront. Let me give you a couple of examples. Well, I'll give you one example because I'm going too slowly. I'm talking too long. Here's a case that's so interesting historically in the United States. 1868. There's a Treaty of Fort Laramie is signed between the Sioux Nation tribes. That's actually three different tribes, the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota tribes, to give them undisturbed use and occupation of land that they already had access to. It's an enormous swath of land that included the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was a very resource-rich region of Western South Dakota. But if you actually look if you go online and check the Treaty of Fort Laramie, that was just a small part of an enormous part of the United States that was to be reserved for the Sioux Nation tribes. 1868. No sooner is it signed off, 6 years later, that this gold is discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And this precipitates the famous gold rush. Thousands of white settlers moving in to these regions that were to be reserved for the Sioux to stake claims for gold. The U.S. government, under the treaty, the U.S. government had an obligation to protect the boundaries and prevent white settlers from trespassing. It instead rips up the treaty. It refuses to deter the influx of prospectors, violating this accord. The LDN go to court in the 1970s. By 1980, the case is before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it denies the Sioux claim to return the land. Instead, it offers the tribes compensation in the amount of $102 million. What happens next is interesting. The Sioux refuse these funds, despite they have no further legal recourse. In the United States, after the Supreme Court, you're done, and yet they refuse compensation. Why? This isn't rational. Let's take a look. Here it is in their own words. They announce that they will not bargain for this land. The land was put there by the supreme being for the indigenous race, and it is the site of religion, traditions, culture. It is the center. It is central to their existence as a people, and therefore it cannot be equated with any amount of money. That was in 1980. The funds that were allocated to the tribe sit in a fund accruing interest. Today, they are worth well over $1.3 billion, which isn't adequate. It's not enough, but it's not zero. And yet the tribe continues to refuse payment for the land. In cases like this, I think this case is a perfect example where moral geometry of the standard sort fails us because the injustice, the loss, cannot be compensated for. It is an irreparable harm. I will skip talking about Charles Dickens, but there's this lovely passage where the Marquis, and this is in The Tale of Two Cities, kills a child, his carriage runs over a child and kills the child. The Marquis is angry that the child was in the road, angry at the parents for letting this happen, throws a gold coin out into the crowd and says, there you go, there's your compensation. And the the carriage driver is about to take off when the coin is flung back into the carriage by the father whose child has whose life has just been destroyed by the virtue of the death of his son. And the Marquis is furious and says, I would willingly kill whichever one of you just sent this back to me. I mean, after all, the Marquis had compensated the man for the loss of his child, The father has actually been wronged twice. First, His son has been killed by the reckless action of the Monsieur, the Marquis. Second, the child's life and the father's harm has been trivialized by the offer of monetary compensation. The question I want to put to all of us is, how often are people harmed in this way as a consequence of what well-meaning, well-trained economists do? If there are certain harms that are not reparable through compensation, then one may not use moral geometry of the sort we've been trained to use. Let's talk about cases, and just one case, the case of international trade, because we all know it. We've all been trained to know that trade liberalization is welfare enhancing, therefore we should all support it. We also are trained to know that people suffer in the short run. How do they suffer? Well, typically, some people lose their jobs. There's a short-term adjustment cost. That's the little the ripples on the pond getting smaller, and then they are back to work and they are made better off in the long run, but they suffer in the short run. We are trained to think that the loss is largely the loss of income, full stop. There's no cascading harms. And maybe the loss of job. If you lose your job and you liked your job, well, then maybe you also lose job satisfaction. Caldor wrote about that. And that's it. But now let's really think about how people are harmed when a community loses jobs, unemployment goes up. This is typically what happens from trade liberalization. Here's Amartya Sen, 1999. He talks about psychological harm. This is harms from rising unemployment. Psychological harm, loss of work motivation, skill, self-confidence, increases in ailments and even in morbidity and mortality rates, disruption of family and social life, hardening of social exclusion, accentuation of racial tensions and gender asymmetries, end quote. Or Nina Pavnik. Nina Pavnik is, in my view, one of the best of the relatively new trade economists working today. She is a fan of trade liberalization, and yet she's very careful to pay attention to the harms. She talks about the concentrated adverse effects of trade liberalization on adult labor markets that spill over into worse educational outcomes for children in affected families. This is important. This is an instance of compounding harms over time, where the harms actually get worse as they move from one generation to the next. Increased crime rates, worse health outcomes, and so forth. The question I put to our profession is this: are all of these harms reparable? And are they all reparable via compensation? If the answer is no, then we have no business using Kaldor-Hicks or social welfare functions or cost-benefit analysis in our defense of trade liberalization, but that's exactly what we've been doing for at least since the 1930s. All right, I want to show you, and I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly here. And I hope this isn't too small to see on your screen. I'll talk you through it. This is how the profession handles the issue of trade liberalization. Imagine that there are commensurable substitutable goods. Now imagine that there might be incommensurable non-substitutable goods. There are reparable harms and there are irreparable harms. Essentially, the definition of harm and the framework of harm that I've presented earlier leads us to conclude that all harms reside in the northwest quadrant in this little matrix here. Why? Because we've already treated all goods as commensurable and substitutable. If all goods are commensurable and substitutable, then all harms must be reparable. And all the other cells in this matrix are empty. It's this strategy that allows us to use Kaldor-Hicks, let's say, in the case of trade liberalization. But is that the case? We've just looked at some of the other harms. I've reproduced here the quotations from Nina Pavnik. Are all of these harms reparable? Do they all fit into that northwest quadrant? I want to suggest to you, of course, you can see where I'm going here, that they don't. This is, for me, a more adequate account. Here, we do recognize that, sure, there are some goods that are commensurable and substitutable, that there are some commensurable substitutable goods. When we lose those, we can be fully repaired through some sort of compensation. Those harms exist in the northwest quadrant. But if there are incommensurable, non-substitutable goods, then we may have all kinds of harms that are reparable, but not through not through any kind of compensation. We're talking about non-compensable harms. I argue in the book, and I won't go into this too much here, but what is required in those cases is acknowledgement of the harm, not payment of money like the father in Charles Dickens. Payment of money trivializes, it amplifies the harm because it suggests that there's a price that can be put on that child's life. In this case, what is required is apology, sympathy. In some cases, there might be gratitude for first responders, for example, after a crisis, recognition, respect, and honor for those who are going to be put in the position to suffer on behalf of others. But then, of course, there may be some of these harms that are completely irreparable. And in this case, remedial measures may be entirely unavailable. If the practice that we pursue as economists in endorsing policies and strategies generate any of the harms in the bottom row, then our standard moral geometry fails us. We're able to sustain it only by a fiction that all the harms reside in the Northwest South. All right, I'm going to make just one other point here before I quickly move to where we might go instead, how we might do better. There's other problems that I think that are forced upon us by our moral geometry. One is that we over-recognize harm. That is to say, we see harm everywhere all the time, and that then leads to mistakes about how we theorize it. And another is that we misrecognize harm. Here's a quote by John Hicks that I think is commonly embraced in economics. He argues that any ordinary change in the price system damages people, benefits people on one side of the market and damages people on the other. Any change in the price system. And since any policy invariably changes the price system, any policy will generate losers. Now, to agree with Hicks, you have to have a notion of harm. And here I've got a welfare scale. Going to the right is improvement. Going to the left is harm. Where we've got two agents, Maria and Jamal. Now, of course, Maria is in much better position than is Jamal before some policy intervention. Now imagine that there's a policy intervention that shifts Maria a little bit to the left. She's given up some caviar. Now imagine Jamal. He's had to give up necessities of life, imagine, as a consequence of this policy shift. Under standard moral geometry, the baseline for judging whether these individuals have been harmed is their own position prior to the policy intervention. So if Maria was at X prior to the policy intervention, that's the standard we use for judging whether she's been harmed. If Jamal was at X, that's the standard we use. And so if this policy shifts them both down, or shifts one down, let's say either one down, we would conclude that they are both, that each of them is harmed. This is true. There's no special status given here to Jamal's situation, even though notice that he was in worse situation before and after the change, and the shift is much greater for him than it is for Maria. What we're lacking here is any kind of, let's call it a catastrophe baseline. Let's imagine that there's a catastrophe baseline, a point at which life, if you shift below it, your life is no longer, for example, your life is no longer worth living. I've introduced it there. It's a common catastrophe line for everybody in society. In this case now, we see that the change in Maria's situation is trivial relative to the change in Jamal's situation, because his shift from X to Y actually has him traverse the catastrophe line. His life has become not, let's say, not worth living. Moral geometry gets around this problem of giving special consideration to Jamal simply by asserting that there is no common catastrophe line. I think that this is a conversation we need to have in economics. Is there? Should we give special consideration to certain shifts in people's level of whatever you want to call it, let's say welfare, just to stay with the standard approach? The problem is swept aside, and so there's nothing morally distinguished the harm done to Maria here and the harm done to Jamal. There's one other point, I'm sorry, and then this will be the last. In economics, we make no distinction. We make no distinction between not benefiting and harming. How do we do this? We treat not benefiting as causing harm. Let me give you an example. In my city, and probably your cities around the world, there's been tremendous effort to gentrify the city center, to knock down the old buildings and the old houses and build up beautiful new hotels and art and convention centers and all the rest. Imagine that Maria, who's really well-to-do, is going to be a beneficiary of this policy if it's enacted. Jamal, who lives downtown and is very low income, he's going to lose not just the apartment that he lives in, which is about to be scraped to put up a fancy condo tower. He not only loses his dwelling, he loses his community. All of his friends, the people who live in his community, are going to be shipped out to we don't know where to make room for this. Now, if the policy goes forward, it's clear to see that Jamal will be harmed. He's moving from X to Y. Maria, if the policy does not go forward, Maria doesn't move anywhere. So you might then think that we can claim under the logic I just shared with you a moment ago, that relative to her baseline X, she's not harmed at all. So the policy would harm Jamal, would not help Maria. We should not endorse the policy. But economists do it differently. They look and see that if the policy were to happen, Maria could shift from position X to position Y. Her welfare would improve when she moves into a nice condo downtown. Her baseline in this case is treated as her potential welfare, Y, not her actual welfare, X. And she is then thought to be harmed if the policy does not go forward. Now, why is this so ethically important? Because it transforms a situation where we're comparing benefiting Maria against harming Jamal into a situation where we're just comparing respective harms. The harms that will happen to Jamal if the policy does go forward, we're comparing it to the harm that will befall Maria if the policy does not go forward. We have escaped the problem that philosophers call the priority of harm. In the liberal tradition, the idea in law, for example, is that one must privilege not harming. We're not allowed to say, snatch a kidney from one person to give it to another, even if the benefit to one will be greater than the harm to the other. But in this case, in economics, we engage in economic kidney snatching all the time. We are snatching Jamal's dwelling to make Maria, against his will, to make Maria better off. My argument is not that we should never treat not benefiting as harm. That's not my argument. My argument is that when to treat not benefiting as harm and when not to treat it as harm is an ethically fraught question that our profession has swept under the rug by just assuming that when someone is denied a benefit, they are actually being harmed. All right, I want to end by saying, how might we do economics differently if we took harm seriously? In the book, I have a chapter on two different things. One is taking a harm-centric approach. I'm going to talk about that. The other is to focus on, take better account of the harms that arise from uncertainty. I'm running out, I've talked too long, so I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'd be so happy to answer questions about it or to converse with anyone by email or privately if you'd like to talk about that. Imagine that we take harm central to our practice. So rather than thinking of economics as delivering goods, we think of economics also as, and maybe even first and foremost, as trying to reduce and ameliorate harms. I argue in the book that this would require a very different kind of practice. I argue for what I call economic harm profile analysis, where we actually judge societies, we investigate societies to see what kinds of harms they permit, what kinds they create, and which kinds they either prevent and ameliorate. And if one were to do this, I argue that there's at least 5 different aspects to doing a full economic harm profile analysis. One would have to look to see what harms are prevalent and averted or insured against in a community, which harms are productive and which harms are instead gratuitous. What harms, that is to say, what harms are not doing anybody any good at all. Sometimes a harm can be productive because it's the only way to achieve a valued good, but other harms are just useless. So we might want to explore and compare societies in terms of the productivity of the harms that they permit. Of course, we'd want to take a look at the distribution of harms. Is it the case that some people are harmed today, but they're going to benefit tomorrow? That the distribution of harms is serially independent? Or in our society, is it the case that those who lose today are going to lose tomorrow and the next day and the next day? Next, we'd want to look at the mechanisms of harm generation and distribution. And finally, we would want to take a look at consent and coercion. Are people willingly accepting the risks of harm that they face? Or do we find that in a particular society, lots of people are coerced into economic contests where they are almost certain to be harmed? I'm not going to go any deeper into this, but let me just show you let me just show you some of the subcategories of let me go to coercion and consent. Here are some of the subcategories when you think about what it means to be free to accept the risk of harm versus being coerced. We might want to know the extent and intensity of coercion within any particular economic contest in the system. Next, we might want to know the extent of coercion to participate in any particular contest. We then might want to know the extent of coercion or the depth of coercion to participate in any particular class of contests. These would be different contests, but that all have essentially the same risk profile, so that from the perspective of the person who's going to lose, they're all essentially equivalent. And then finally, we might want to look at the extent and intensity of coercion to participate in any particular economic system, about which I'd be happy to talk, but we don't have time for me to go into that now. I'm going to skip talking about uncertainty. I just want to say there's so much more to be said about questions of harm than I've been able to talk about today, or even to include in the book. The point is, we need a new tradition in economics, the study of economic harm and economist-induced harm. I think that would push us away from moral geometry. I think geometry is good for the profession. It gives us influence in the world. I would argue it is not good for those we purport to serve. This is a quote from a philosopher, Radist, from whom I take the concept of moral geometry. He's not talking about economics, but it's a lovely statement about what's wrong, not just with economic moral geometry, but with any moral geometry that attempts to take complex, fraught ethical issues and reduce them down to some simplistic decision rule. I think he's right on this matter. I think our profession is wrong on this matter, and I look forward to the day when we think about harm in a much more complex ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, for this excellent talk. Now we have Caterina Marchionni as our discussant. Caterina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me right? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank George for the intriguing talk and the very interesting and rich book that I had the pleasure to read to prepare for today. Yeah, so I fully endorse the message of the book and the talk, namely the economists, and I would add philosophers of economics, have paid too little attention to the responsibilities of economics towards the unintended harmful effects of their policy advice and their scientific claims. And so let me really congratulate, because I think this is a hugely important endeavor, given the influence and authority that economics and economists play in our societies. One that I've also started to think a bit about over the last year or so. And even though there is quite much to agree with in the book, and of course there's gonna be myriad things I'd like to discuss more with you, George. I had to make some choices. And yeah, so in this kickoff of the Q&A, I would like to focus on two issues. Where I'm pushing back a bit, but mostly I want to find out more. Mostly I want to find out more about where you stand, and of course, maybe the focus is motivated by my own interests in these kinds of questions. The first issue concerns the relevance. What do you think about this a distinction that is often made between academic economists and professional economists? It seems to me that regardless of how sharp we can make these distinctions, of course, a particular person might fulfill both roles. It does seem to me to matter when we are thinking in terms of responsibilities of economists. And it's especially relevant in the context of your analogy, it seems to me, between econogenic harms and iatrogenic harms. Iatrogenic harms, I don't think you've mentioned, I don't think you use the terms in this talk, but it's the harms that are induced by, medical practice and medical practitioners. And so George in the book says how, and I think rightly so, in medicine there is a tradition of thinking about the harms that arise from medical practice, but there is no such thing in economics. But I think this is, I think the analogy is, it's inspiring, but I think it breaks down. And it breaks down especially when we are thinking about professional economists. And let me explain why. So even in the case of professional economists, it is unclear the extent to which the analogy holds. After all, think about the causal chain that goes from a doctor, intervening on me when I'm sick, and a professional economist giving advice on a policy to a policymaker. So think about there is going to be lots of things intervening in between, right? The effects of the policy and the policy advice. There is the policymakers, there is going to be the politicians, there's going to be those who implement the policy, and several institutions, so on and so forth. And so it is unclear whether we can actually attribute any causal, whether there is enough causal contribution from the academic from the professional economists to the harmful effects. But I'm with you, and I am happy to maybe stretch the analogy this far to include the academic economists. But now let's think about the professional economists, sorry. But now let's think about the academic economists. Those who are sitting in their ivory towers and building their own simple models of trade theory. How much can we tell? How much can we say that the harms of a policy inspired by a model in trade theory is somehow induced by anything that the economist has done? And I don't want to say that I don't think it happened. I don't want to say that I don't think economists are off the hook completely, academic economists, but I think we might have to rethink how we attribute responsibilities. It doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be the same kind of responsibility that is to be attributed to the medical practitioner, to the doctor who cures someone, right? It's not, the harms there are pretty much directly caused by the doctor. Another aspect in which the analogy, I think, seems to break here is, or that makes the analogy more complicated. And I guess you can, this might apply also in the context of medicine. But think about the kind of responsibilities academic economists have. So it could be argued that the main responsibility of an academic economist, of a scientist, is not bettering people's, it's delivering the truth. It's someone else's responsibility to use the knowledge that economists provide in order to come up with, you know, policies that work and do and better people's lives. Yeah, so I would like to hear a bit more. So have you thought about these distinctions? How much you think your framework in terms of like economics induced harms might need to be revised in order to accommodate this distinction. If I have time, I'll bring up the second issue. Is a bit shorter, and it's about the moral geometry. It's really much more about the stuff you've talked today. And I think I agree with you. And as you said, it's also something that people as influential as Amartya Sen have discussed before. And I agree that more like the kind of moral geometry economists usually engage in, interpreted as a framework for ethical decision making, is really problematic. But then I was wondering whether we can think about welfare analysis, let's say, as just a way of thinking systematically about who's going to gain, who's going to lose from a particular policy change. And whether, as such, as a framework for systematically thinking and comparing, it might actually play still a role in in the kind of alternative decision-making mechanisms that you're thinking about, like this decision-making under deep uncertainty. It seems to me that if we do have something where we can actually say, you know, Maria gains in this and Jamal loses in this, we still want to have that information, even if we are to take decisions under uncertainty. Okay, it doesn't mean that that should be the ethical foundation for our decision. Okay, as a matter of fact, I'm not sure economists should be in the business at all of doing ethics, right? I mean, I'm not sure they are the right persons to do ethics, but like as scientists aren't, right? So I think at some point today you've talked about this, the moral geometry, to decide on moral geometries, like that we need a moral geometry to, I think that's a job, that's what ethics does, right? I'm not sure I would expect, I want economists to give me the moral geometry to decide on the moral geometries. But then if we can think about this, like if we can strip for example, welfare analysis from its, and take it away from its ethical interpretation. So there is, it doesn't tell you how you should decide, which principle to decide, which principle to use in decision making. It just provides you a way of thinking systematically about losses and gains. Then would it still maybe play a useful role in the kind of scenario exploration involving stakeholders that's involved in the decision making under deep uncertainty framework that you endorse, which I think, by the way, it's a quite a very interesting alternative. But yeah, so I wonder whether it could still play a role there. And I think with this I end, and I would like to hear your answers, and then I leave time for others to contribute to Q&A. Thanks very much for the opportunity and for the book.
Many thanks. George, would you like to reply?
Sure, but I'll do it briefly in case others would like to join in. Caterina, first of all, thank you. I'm flattered and humbled that you read the book, and I so appreciate your comments. I guess I'll take them in reverse order. The question of whether welfarism nevertheless provides useful information because it's as a method for systematically exploring and giving us some systematic knowledge about impacts. And so can't it be a part of some other decision-making procedure? I don't have any problem with welfare about harm. The problem, of course, is when it colonizes kinds of harms that it's inappropriate for. Not all harms should be reduced down to welfare. Typically these days, welfare is defined in terms of preference satisfaction. Not all harms should be thought of in terms of preference satisfaction. But there might be some that are, and in those cases, a welfarist approach might have something to say for sure. If you go back to that little matrix I had, the harms that were in the northwest corner where goods are considered, where the goods at stake are commensurable and substitutable, that's the domain where welfare might have something to say. Welfare analysis might be useful. In the other quadrant, the other cells, it has no business. You know, we can systematize and systematize in exactly the wrong way. So here's a question. How much, let's do a little cost benefit analysis here. How many of us think that the free press is a good idea? Freedom of thought or the free press? Everybody on this panel would raise their hand. Okay, here's my next question. How much are you prepared to pay? How much would you be willing to pay out of your salary to secure freedom of speech or the free press? I gather those numbers and I do a cost benefit analysis. I compare the costs because there's lots of costs, and I decide, and my systematic study shows me that the costs are greater than the benefits of the free press. You would say, rightly, this is the wrong geometry. This is the wrong way to think about whether we should have freedom of religion, freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom of press. So systemize, but it's a systematic one. I would say back to you, it's systematic. I counted the numbers. The wrong systematic thinking can be horribly, horribly dangerous. We need to make sure we're using the right system of thought as concerns any particular kinds of goods and any particular kinds of harms. So to finish, yes to welfarism being among the standards we might use, but only for harms that are in that northwest cell. And I would argue that in most policy decisions, not all harms are captured in that cell. With respect to this other question you raise about academic economists and practicing, or what you call professional economists, I wrestle with this a lot. One of the points that one of the inferences I take from the distance between the economist and the ultimate action, there's you put it perfectly. There's the economist whispering into the ear of the decision maker, but then the decision maker has many other people bearing on him or her. Then there's politics, and then there's a million other factors. So at the end of the day, what gets implemented is not what the economist had advocated. You know who makes this argument? Jeffrey Sachs. He says, yeah, things went terrible in Russia, but that's because they didn't do what I told them to do. They didn't do all the things that I said. I said that they needed, that this radical transformation in the economy had to be, shock therapy had to be associated with lots of foreign assistance, and that didn't come through. I am therefore not culpable or responsible. Now there's two issues here. One is moral culpability, You didn't talk about that. The other is the causal connection. That's what I think you were talking about. I think Jeffrey Sachs is wrong in every single respect. Here's why. Jeffrey Sachs went into this arrangement thinking he had a degree of control he could not possibly have, and that's the key. Economists never exert control in the world. What economists exert in the world is influence. Consider two different worlds. The world where the professional exerts control, and then the world where the professional only exerts influence without control. In the first case, the ethical questions are the ones that ethicists have been asking forever. Should we use utilitarianism or deontological ethics or care ethics? The presumption is that what ethics we have in our head will then determine the outcome. That's difficult. Philosophers have wrestled with this for millennia. But here's a more ethically fraught situation. What if we only enjoy influence without control? That was the Jeffrey Sachs problem. He could have lots of influence, I would argue, not causal. He has influence. He's one of the vectors that go into the outcome without any control. And when you're in a situation where you enjoy influence and a lot of influence with no control, the ethical questions compound. They become much more difficult. How do you comport yourself ethically when you know that you're in a world where you don't enjoy any control, you only enjoy influence? Because in that world, things can go very, very wrong. I would argue that Jeffrey Sachs is culpable, but wasn't causal. Now that's a conversation we'd have to have, because I'm not sure if I'm right about this, and I could be desperately wrong. I don't think he's causal because he didn't have the lever. He's not living in a control world where he could pull a dial and make something happen. He didn't have causal control, but what he had was influence, and he didn't take adequate account of the ways in which that influence could ramify and destroy people's lives. But I'm talking about Jeffrey Sachs, but he was no different from the leading lights in our profession during the neoliberal revolution. They really thought they had a degree of control that it's impossible for economists to have. I won't go any further. The distinction between professional and academic, it's just a matter for me of degree. But what I've just said, I think, applies actually to both. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both. We will now open the discussion to our audience. And before doing that, I will stop the recording so that there is a more relaxed environment here. But before that, I want to just thank both of you for your great talks. And I want to thank the audience for being here. And I thank in advance for their contributions during the discussion. And I also want to thank our team at the ReSES Argumenta project for making all this possible. Thanks, everyone. So